Hello, I'm Hermione Hudson, PwC's UK Head of Audit. Thank you for joining us for the first of two LinkedIn Audit Lives, where we're exploring the issue of green jobs and women. Before we get started, I'd just like to let you know that you can turn on captions if you'd prefer. Just go to the three dots on the top right-hand side of the live screen. These audio lives are part of PwC's activities around International Women's Day, the theme of which this year is embracing equity. I think equity, as opposed to equality, is very interesting. And embracing equity means understanding that we aren't all starting from the same position and that we need to support the actions that are needed to drive equality. As we begin to transition to a lower carbon economy, almost any job has the potential to be a green job. So why are women not in the same place as men when it comes to being an equal part in that solution, despite evidence of their greater impact in some cases? 2 years ago, we launched our Green Jobs Barometer, which helps people understand how well the UK is managing the move to a net zero economy. It shows how well each region is doing, so we can easily see the areas that need help. And we know from our 2022 Women in Work report that things are not equal when it comes to gender and green jobs. In a moment, we'll talk about what can be done to address this. But first, let me introduce my guests. I'm delighted to be joined by Fran Deininger. Fran leads the Gender and Climate Work Programme at the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. So Fran, can you tell us briefly why combine gender and climate?
Hi, Hermione. Really great to be here this morning. Thank you so much for having me. And you've really asked the central question, why gender and climate? And I think I could spend an hour trying to answer the question, so I'll keep it brief for the sake of the audience. But at COP27, we still saw this kind of sea of black suits, right? We still see that women are not present in decision-making tables, in boardrooms, in climate dialogues, and this is really a huge issue for climate action, right? How can we design solutions, both in mitigation and adaptation, with one hand tied behind our backs, without tapping into 50% of the global population? And that is really where this theme of gender and climate starts. Now, the second piece, and I'll stop after this, is, we really don't have the resources, the time, or the capacity to confront gender inequality and climate change in parallel. So we really need to think about integrating them and identifying avenues where they can amplify each other.
Thank you, Fran. Lots to talk about there, but let me introduce my second guest. Our second guest today is Nicole Demarsh. Nicole is an associate partner and co-lead of the consulting practice at Sagana, and she spent the last decade developing expertise in impact investing with a focus on gender lens and climate integration. So Nicole, how significant is the effort to use finance as a tool for gender equality?
Hermione, thank you so much for having me on this morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to be talking about this subject. It's a very interesting question you ask about finance and gender equity. Broadly speaking, the term gender lens investing is used to define exactly that, using finance as a tool to kind of close the gender gap and work towards gender equity. And it's a very exciting and quickly growing space. Project SAGE is a report that tries to track the progress around gender lens investing. And just last year, they identified over 200 private fund managers actively investing with a gender lens and representing over $6 billion in assets under management. And interestingly, that was almost a 50% growth from only 18 months prior when they'd done the previous report. So really, really quickly growing. We also see public investors coming into the space. So some of the largest governments, development finance institutions have pledged over $15 billion towards investing with a gender lens under the 2X collaborative. So a really, really, really exciting and interesting space to be chatting about this morning.
Yeah, thank you. And again, gender lens investing coming together with climate investing, I think very, very interesting for us to talk about. And finally, let me introduce our third guest, Simon Gallow. Simon is the HeForShe lead for UN Women UK. So Simon, what are your thoughts on the theme of this year's International Women's Day campaign, Embracing Equity?
Thanks for the question. And again, huge thank you to everyone on the panel and for everyone joining us for this really important discussion. I think the topic this year of embracing equity goes to the heart of the discussion today, and splitting those two words in two, taking them each in turn. When we think about embracing, it goes to the heart of the point that we cannot look at each of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the 17 goals that have been agreed by governments as we head to 2030, in isolation. We need to embrace all of them collectively, look at everything and holistically, and we cannot tackle the climate crisis without having gender equity. It's as simple as that. And then looking at the word equity, as we've already pointed out, it's really moving the narrative from equality to equity, as we realize that we need to include all women in this discussion, those of intersecting ethnicities, sexualities, and abilities, because unless we do that, we won't have a proper, better and sustainable future. And really, when we look at the climate crisis, you cannot look at it without understanding that poverty is one of the crucial drivers. 8 in 10 people displaced by natural disaster are women. Women are 14 times more likely to die in natural disaster. Poverty and class and many other intersecting factors are intrinsically linked. So until we move the dial on our debate and talk about equity, we cannot solve some of our gravest problems around the world.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I think you made the case very much for why women are so much impacted by climate change. But our 2022 Women in Work report looked at the green economy and found an emerging gender gap. So whilst a third of men thought they had sufficient skills to work in a green job, only a fifth of women felt the same. And we can see that this is increasing as more and more proportionally more men are moving into green jobs. So one of the things I want to talk about is, why is this gender inequality happening, and what do we think are the characteristics that actually we need in green jobs? And Fran, if I come to you, you mentioned your work after COP27, and your article talks about workforces and leadership with greater gender diversity have characteristics that are critical in combating the climate crisis. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. There is this growing body of evidence that is linking more women's voices, more gender diversity, more gender inclusion, whether that's in the workforce, in senior management, also in corporate boards, to more robust action on climate. So actually setting more robust climate actions such as, actually allocating capital towards climate objectives, but then also actual climate outcomes. So we see that there is a link between women's voices being present in decision-making circles and actually better outcomes when it comes to climate change. Now, the characteristics or the why this is, we have a decade of research that, essentially represents the business case for more gender equity, for more gender inclusion in the workforce. Tapping into more diverse perspectives allows companies to be more competitive, to have better pricing decisions, to tap into new markets. So there's essentially a decade of evidence that shows this business case. Now, when we discuss climate change and what companies are doing around climate change, there's two key aspects, right? There's climate risk management and, being able to effectively incorporate the transitional risks, the physical risks, the credit risks that climate change poses on one side, but then also being able to tap into new opportunities that climate change or the climate transition represents, developing climate innovations, developing new products and services in a more sustainable and resilient manner. And these two aspects, both on the risk mitigation side and on the realizing opportunities side, businesses will benefit from including more voices and really embracing equity, both within their workforce, but also within their leadership. So there is a strong business case, and this continues to hold even when we look at, climate action and climate risk management.
Thank you, Fran. And I think, Simon, you wanted to come in there. I have to say, I'm interested in why women feel that they don't have as many skills for a green job as men do, and what needs to be done to change that. But Simon, I think you also had a comment. Simon, I'm afraid I think you're on mute at the moment.
Apologies about that. Technology in the morning. Yeah, just wanted to build on what Fran said, that I totally agree with. Really important point. Global UN Women research shows that while 20% of the land globally is owned by women, actually when women do have resources at their fingertips, they reinvest 90% of it in their communities, whether it's human capital, goods, and others. So actually we talk about feminist leadership. We've got amazing examples about that in the business world, also in our governments around the world, examples including Angela Merkel, Jacinda Ardern, and others recently, that really back up the evidence that show that you need women at the table making really urgent climate decisions.
Thank you, Simon. And Nicole, I think that brings us on very nicely to how do you actually apply a gender lens when it comes to investing? Simon talked about the need for us to invest in, women-led organizations and those sorts of things. How does that work in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot more that we need to do. So I know a couple of minutes ago, I spoke excitedly about how quickly growing the space of gender lens investing is and how exciting it is. But the honest truth is there's a lot more work that needs to be done, just as there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of thinking about our solutions for climate change as well. If I look back on the past couple of years, we see that there's still only 3% of venture capital funding going towards women-led and women-founded startups. Many of which have absolutely brilliant solutions that need to be scaled if we're going to address and tackle climate change. We see that there's trillions of dollars in a gap required to close this kind of gender equity financing gap. We need a lot more resources being mobilized into this space. And I really think a lot of the challenge is around a lack of awareness, particularly on the part of fund managers and investors. I can't echo enough everything Fran said about the very clear evidence that investing in a gender lens, investing in women, has both commercial and climate outcomes. And these are exactly the sorts of things that investors are looking for today. There's been a longitudinal study done by Credit Suisse looking at the impacts of more diverse teams. And the results are very clear. They really lead to higher returns on capital, higher margins and higher profit margins, and also lower volatility in the face of a changing environment like climate change, like economic downturn. These are exactly the sorts of things that investors can and should be looking for. And similarly, when we see the sorts of commitments that people are starting to make around ESG and ESG investing, we need women as part of that, thinking about the fact that inclusive teams, again, have these better risk mitigation practices, more innovation as it comes to kind of sustainable solutions. So for me, I think that's really what we need, is we need to be using platforms like this to be amplifying the case. We need more hard research. We need more case studies to be crowding trillions of more dollars into kind of this intersection of gender lens and climate.
Yeah, thank you. And just last week, we reported that in 2022, women launched a record number of a record-breaking number of businesses, and more than twice the level that there were in 2018, which is fantastic. But more than half of those businesses reported finding access to finance and investment difficult. And you make such a great case that actually, investing in women-led businesses gives a great return. At the same time, we've talked about women perhaps not seeing themselves as being able to take on the roles in green jobs. What do we think is holding people back? And it's a question to everybody, really. What do you think would make a difference? It's hard when I say a question to everyone, isn't it? Because then nobody speaks. So, Nicole, because it starts off with an investing one, let me come to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually a question that I often get asked by investors and by their portfolio companies. When you make this case, they say, okay, this is great. Understand the statistics. I can't find women. This is really, really challenging. And for me, I think that there's a couple facets here. One is thinking about recruiting, and the other is thinking about kind of your existing organization. And on the recruiting side, there's a lot that needs to be done. Hermione, I thought that was so interesting what you mentioned around, a third of men feeling equipped versus a fifth of women. And this plays out across all industries, not just around green jobs. One of the things that we see that can be really powerful is having more inclusive job descriptions. Women tend to underassume their skills and abilities, and a job description that has a whole list of nice to haves, for example, that aren't actually core to what's required by the job tends to dissuade more female applicants. And so one of the things to be doing is really thinking about what is core to this job, what are the skills that I need, and test for maybe some of those nice to haves rather in the interview process. And that can kind of open it out. Also thinking around how do you expand the pipeline? Putting targets like gender balance shortlists can really kind of force the hand to say, how do we look for industry associations? How do we find recruiters that have more diverse pipeline? There are very talented applicants out there, and really holding yourself to be kind of looking for these talented men and women. And then very quickly on the organizational side, the other thing that I often see is a lot of talented women at lower ranks in the organization, and a difficulty in kind of retaining or promoting women into higher ranks. And a lot of these statistics that Fran and I were talking about with regards to performance are really clear when you've got women in senior leadership and women in governance, right? So we need that at all levels of the organization. And then it's really important to be looking at your performance management systems. What does it take to get promoted in your organization? Are there certain things that bias towards or against certain groups? How do you think about kind of the benefits? How do you look at things like mentorship and allyship to be having kind of women staying within the organization and moving to increasingly senior roles?
Thank you, Nicole. And actually, you mentioned allyship and mentorship, which is something that we're very focused on at PwC. But I know, Simon, you've talked about allyship and actually going beyond allyship, and what is the role of men, particularly in creating equity and gender equality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the short answer that I respond to the question with is that women do not need to change. The structures around women that hold them back are the things that really need to urgently change. Obviously, as we all know, more diverse, inclusive businesses, governments, etc., lead to better outcomes. The issue is that there are just barriers along the way that stop women reaching everything that they possibly could. We still live in a world where just 4% of the CEOs in our FTSE 350 companies are women. Not only does that lead to bad governance and poor decision making, but it means that if you are a young girl looking up to aspiring role models, you don't see people that look like you. And when you look at the number of women of colour in those positions, the number is 0. So you have even if you're a young black girl, you have even fewer role models to look up to. So absolutely, this is a really important issue, and it needs to go to the very heart. When we look at things like education, etc., it's really, really important there. And of course, the role of men is critical to this, and is fundamental to my motivations for supporting UN Women and this debate. Fundamentally, so many of the issues that women face in their lives are because of my gender, because of men, because of masculinity. And so until we engage men and boys in the debate around these issues, we will not have longer term solutions. And then the second point to make, which goes to the heart of your question, Hermione, is around this really key question around, as I said, moving from allyship to activism, which is that, I have a firm, deeply held belief that equality for women is progress for everyone, including men. And if men are listening in today, thank you so much for joining us. You just have to hear about some of the better decision making, the better climate outcomes, looking at also the statistics around the impacts on women and girls, to understand that if you don't go to the heart of these issues and really understand those experiences that women face, we can't have better decision making and better outcomes in the climate sphere. So yeah, I guess really just to kind of round up, moving from allyship to activism, what I mean by that is really men stepping forward, understanding the benefits of equity and really understanding their role as gatekeepers in some of these decision-making spaces, relieving some of that power to ensure that women have a seat at the table and we can properly solve this climate crisis.
Thank you, Simon. And Fran, let me bring you in there because we started at the, how do we get more women into these sorts of roles? What's your view?
Yeah, I just would like to say first, I completely agree with both what Simon and Nicole have said, and would like to, pick up on a few different pieces here. I think one really critical piece is normative change. I think when people still hear women when they hear gender, and just coming off Simon's point, gender is about inclusion. It's about whose voices are present, right? And we can enhance business outcomes, climate outcomes, the whole gamut of outcomes if we have a more inclusive space, both in the corporate sector, but also, in the public sector. And, I think in order to actually address and change norms, that involves men and boys, right? Because ultimately, we need to create space for that inclusion to take place, for that diversity of opinion and perspectives to be able to have space. There needs to be, as Simon said, some relinquishing or some opening the doors, from the perspective of those currently in leadership roles, in upper management roles. So that's maybe just the first point. And the second one is, I think there's a growing number of girls entering STEM, in more technical fields. But what we are finding is that there's a huge drop-off in the school to work transition. And that is a space that we really need to be looking at, because ultimately it's not just about upskilling, reskilling women for jobs of the future in more technical roles, but it's also about supporting women once they arrive in the workplace. So not just about recruitment, that's more gender sensitive, but also how do we create a workplace environment that's amenable, that's comfortable, that is, attractive for women, that they can then also progress into kind of the upper echelons, into corporate boards, into senior management, so that they can then, be an aspiration or something for younger people who are just starting out at the bottom of the, corporate ladder. So I think those are just some points that I think are really important to highlight. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. And a few things have been mentioned that really resonate with me. I mean, certainly, Nicole, you mentioned gender balanced recruitment lists, and that's something that we saw a big change from introducing at PwC. That it makes you think differently, makes you work harder, and actually makes you work your recruiters harder to look for people. Because Nicole, you said sometimes people are feeling that they just can't find the women in these roles, and Fran, you talked about the need for us to really get that transition from school into the workplace for women in certain roles, and making it attractive, making it an attractive thing to do. And I think certainly that's something that we're focused on PwC, but I see it much more broadly, that how do we make the broader working world as attractive to women? And some of these roles, there are stereotypes around kind of the sorts of people who might enjoy them, the sorts of people who might work there. Fran, you said that, COP was still a sea of black suits. Well, we clearly need to change that. And everybody, all the audience can't see us online today. We're audio only, but I'm looking at you all on screen, and none of us are in black suits, I'm pleased to say. So I think some of this is also about what is appealing to the younger generation, because we've talked about gender and we've talked about the climate, but both of these things kind of come together with what is the younger generation looking for, and how do we engage them in this? So I think we've only got a few minutes left, but I would quite like to just go around and ask each of you, what do you think is the thing that we should all be doing as listeners on this to engage the next generation to make change in this way? So Nicole, why don't I come to you first?
Oh, great question. I would say one of the things that I'm seeing with the younger generation is pushing private sector to have a broader lens of responsibility, right? And so not only to be thinking about what does the boardroom look like, what does your senior leadership team look like, but also where are you sourcing from, right? And how are you thinking about gender in your supply chain and from your suppliers? And I think this is something that we need to continue to be bringing more awareness to, and we need to be holding corporations and others to really high standards on. How are you thinking about the role of gender as waste collectors? How are you thinking about them as smallhold farmers growing the food supply? And Simon pointed it out at the top of this very, very clearly. These women and poor women who are often at the core of a lot of these supply chains are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we need to be really thinking about that the whole way through. So I think that would be, in my eyes, one of the important things as we think about pulling in kind of the younger generation.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a really good point. And actually, I see more and more focus on purpose in the private sector. And I think that's really, really what you're saying. Simon, let me come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a really important question. And I think the first thing I'd say is that we shouldn't see children and young people as the leaders of tomorrow. We should see them as the leaders of today. They have so much voice, leadership, and agency that all of us on this call and listening to it have huge amounts to learn from. The climate crisis is fundamental to their now and their future. And if you just look at Fridays for Future, if you look at Greta Thunberg and the extraordinary work that she's done, you just need to understand that this is a real strong area of concern. And just to add, and then they looked at COP27, which is obviously, still, a really important mechanism. It's basically the global mechanism that we have. But 1 in 3 COP27 negotiators were women, and some countries actually had 90% male teams. So with the younger generation, we need to listen to them, give them agency, and learn from them and what they're telling us. And for companies, what that probably looks like is reaching out to young people to get them engaged in their companies, but with a particular hard focus on those communities which are maybe, in inverted commas, harder to reach. One of the areas I know in the UK context that we don't often consider is socioeconomic background and also those of diverse ethnicities. There are communities out there that may be underrepresented in our companies, and we need to work really hard in partnership with those communities, community leaders, to ensure that when they look at companies and government roles, they can maybe be the negotiators of tomorrow.
Thank you, Simon. I would really agree with that. The voice of young people today and the power of young people today, and I think embracing it and making sure we learn from it, and your point also on the importance of companies recognizing their role in social mobility is very important, and certainly something we're focused on. Fran, finally, let me come to you.
Yes, all excellent points made. Just to tap into some of them a bit more, I think, for example, COVID-19 brought certain things to the forefront, such as mental health, an employer's responsibility to take care of its employers. And I think that conversation actually started from very young people who were, concerned about their mental health during the pandemic. And I think there is such a huge sense of innovation, of progression, of also embracing this idea of inclusion that is really coming from the younger generation, who are really tapping into this idea that the corporate world is responsible for certain things, such as, climate change, addressing climate change is responsible for ensuring workforce diversity. It plays a massive role there. And I think that is a trend that is coming from lower generations or generations that are emerging just now into the labor market. And they are full of ideas. I think that is so important, as Simon said, is to create platforms and spaces where we can hear youthful voices and voices, that are coming from multiple perspectives, not just girls and boys, but also looking at other intersections I think that is so critical. The World Bank Group organizes its youth conference once a year, but beyond that, thinking really about how do we design solutions for today, for tomorrow, for the next 10 years, without looking at, the upcoming generation who's going to be confronting climate change to a much more significant extent than we are here today in this room.
Thank you so much, Fran. You're right to pull us to the broader inclusion agenda, which is so important, and the intersectionality between all the things that we have discussed today. So I'm afraid that it's time to draw our discussion to a close. Fran, Nicole, Simon, thank you so much for all joining me this morning. I will be back on Friday speaking to Annie Heaton, CEO of Responsible Steel, Sheridan Ash from Tech She Can, and Gabriella Bosman, founder of the sustainable fashion website Susty. We'll be discussing how we can inspire young girls and women to see the purpose behind green jobs. You can register to attend this by going onto our events page on LinkedIn, and we'll also put it in the comments section. So thank you very much to everyone listening. Have a great day.